Ellie and I had been married for 16 years. Throughout that time, I had been waiting for the proverbial other shoe to drop. Ellie was the most beautiful woman I had ever known. In high school, she was 3 grades younger than me, the homecoming queen, captain of the basketball team, and still held the school records in the 4,800-meter dash. To say she was popular would be an understatement. It would be like saying an eagle can fly. It simply doesn't do her justice. Ellie was a walking dream for every man who could still take a breath. The only reason she knew I existed was because I lived across the street from her, and our parents were friends. This gave me the opportunity to spend time with her since elementary school. After high school, I attended a technical school where I studied carpentry. I was always pretty handy, but I wanted to be more than just a guy with a hammer. I wanted to know the best way to build what I wanted to build. When people looked at the house I was building, I wanted them to know it was going to be the best. After graduation, I started working for myself. It wasn't easy at first, but the quality of my work gradually became better known. Eventually, I hired an assistant, and then 2. By the time I was 25, I had enough orders for the year ahead. Ellie went to college and got a degree in accounting. Did I mention she was almost as smart as she was beautiful? She went to work for a firm that handled all my taxes and helped manage my business accounts. It was then that I finally found the courage to ask her out. My height is about 5 feet 8 inches, and my weight is about 84 pounds. I would never be called an idol, I'm just a regular guy. When Ellie agreed to go on a date with me, I was quite surprised. I knew she had more suitors than Carter has liver pills. I warned myself that she'd go out with me once or twice and then leave. I never understood why she kept dating me and eventually agreed to marry me. I knew I was the luckiest guy on the planet, except for one thing, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was beautiful, smart, athletic, and very pleasant to be around. How long would it take for her to realize that she could find a better man than me? Even after she gave me 2 of the most wonderful girls in the world, Jen and Audrey, I was still afraid it wouldn't last. I had done the only thing I could think of to be the best husband and father I could be. I wasn't handsome, and I wasn't a rich guy, but I was committed to my family and hoped that my efforts would ward off the forces of evil, that inevitable day when Ellie would realize she could make better choices and resent me for keeping her from her destiny. Sunday morning, I was in the basement working on finishing a playroom that the girls could use to hang out with their friends. We had a laundry chute that ran from a large closet next to the kitchen into the basement, so any sounds in the kitchen could be heard in the basement. I heard the doorbell ring, and Ellie opened it. The voices were muffled at first, but as they approached the kitchen, I could hear them clearly. It was Helen Drake, Ellie's best friend. "I won't be long, Ellie. I just wanted to come by and ask if you'd heard the news. Do you know who's back in town?" Helen asked. "Oh, Jay Simpson," suggested Ellie. "Elvis? Jimmy Hoffa? Sasquatch? Osama bin Laden? You'll tell me if I'm close, won't you?" Helen laughed. "Now, I don't feel like telling you," Ellie replied, laughing. "All your versions weren't bad, but still wrong. Do you remember Dan Wilkins?" Helen asked. "I've heard the name, but I can't remember where," Ellie admitted. "I'm sure you can help me remember," Helen said. "Great, you don't remember where you heard that name," Ellie replied. "Didn't you scream it the night you lost your cherry? Didn't you date him for the last 2 years of middle school?" Helen asked. "Now that you bring it up, it seems to be true," Ellie grinned. "He was just over 6 feet tall with blue eyes and the sexiest smile that ever belonged to a man. The point guard on the soccer team, didn't he help the baseball team win a state title?" "I thought I'd add to your memory," Helen agreed. "He divorced the rich, expletive, he was married to and moved back to Westbury to open a law practice. I've heard that his hair growth line has moved back a bit, but he still looks really good." "I'm not surprised he got divorced," Ellie replied. "He always had a thing for women. He was a sports star with great looks, women were always hitting on him. As I recall, you've had a few yourself, Helen laughed. Does Ted know about you and Dan? How's he going to take it when Dan comes back to town? He knows that Dan and I dated for a couple of years. He knows I wasn't a virgin when he and I started dating after college. We've never asked each other about old relationships, Ellie admitted. Some things are better left unsaid. We don't lie to each other, but we've never asked each other a lot of questions about the past. I wish Stan was like that, Helen complained. He hasn't stopped asking me about ex-boyfriends since we got married. Sometimes he seems jealous, and sometimes he seems turned on by what I tell him. Every now and then, I wonder if he's one of those weird guys who likes to watch or something. I don't think he'll be watching for long before he pulls out one of his guns. Don't mistake a little curiosity and excitement for wanting you to have a boyfriend, Ellie cautioned her. I know Stan, and he's old school. If you try that, the expletive will hit the fan. What about you, Ellie? Helen turned the conversation in another direction. What happens when you come face to face with Dan? How will you act? Will you hug him, shake his hand, pretend you don't know him, or go to bed with him? I think I'll shake his hand or hug him, Ellie suggested. I haven't seen this guy in almost 20 years. He might not be too impressed with how I've changed over the years. Yeah, well, you're probably right, Helen said sarcastically. You've gone up a bra size, you've kept your waistline the same, you haven't gotten a wrinkle, and your breasts are still gravity-defying. Dan will be so glad he didn't marry you. That was the last sentence I heard as both women apparently walked toward the front door. I sat down and pondered what I had heard. I knew that Ellie hadn't been a virgin when we'd started dating, and I'd even suspected that Dan Wilkins was the lucky guy who could claim that prize. Now I knew that for sure, and it bothered me for some reason. I was happier not knowing anything for sure about the men she had slept with. I also realized that my fear now had a face and a name. Rumor had it that Dan Wilkins was a high-ranking corporate lawyer. He married a girl from a prominent family in Rhode Island and was the poster boy for the small-town propaganda machine of the local guy who achieved success and a beautiful life. He had become a local celebrity by succeeding in life and staying away from his roots. Now he was returning to Westbury to open a law practice. Combined with the fact that he was single again, I realized my Waterloo was coming. I had never been an athlete or a scholarship athlete. I've never won many awards for hard work. My work doesn't get attention or even popularity. While I always expected something like this to happen, I had no plan to prevent it. Dan was everything I wasn't. You can't change human nature. In the end, I decided to do the only thing I could do, redouble my efforts to be the best husband and father I could be. It wasn't a very good plan, but it was all I could come up with. After a while, I went upstairs for a soda. Ellie was working in the kitchen. Did I hear you talking to someone the other day? I asked. Helen stopped by to chat for a few minutes, Ellie admitted. She didn't stay long. There was no mention of handsome Dan Wilkins coming to town. I pondered that silence as I went back to work in the basement. It was big news to Helen and Ellie, but she never bothered to tell it to me. She didn't feel comfortable discussing her first lover or his return. I had a bad feeling about this guy. The next couple of weeks passed without much happening. I took every opportunity to be a caring father to my girls and a husband to Ellie. I think she was surprised by my attentive behavior but never expressed any doubts. I tried very hard to be a wonderful lover to her. I took her out to dinners and took her shopping. If something did go wrong, I wanted to make sure I did everything I could. Then things started to fall apart. Ellie was the chairperson of a local hospital relief organization. They held events to raise money for equipment needed to keep our hospital up to date. She held this position for several years and did an excellent job. The charity held several fundraising events throughout the year. It was standard practice to get someone from a local business to co-chair the event, so I wasn't surprised when Ellie told me that the charity had asked Dan Wilkins to co-chair Casino Night, which is held every spring. What surprised me even less was that he agreed. He would work closely with Ellie over the next few weeks as they put the event together. I tried my best to hide my fear and depression. I pondered whether I should speak out against it or try to pretend it wasn't a big deal. Indecision plagued me, so I didn't say anything to Ellie. One night before dinner, everything came to a head. "Ted, you've been very quiet lately," Ellie remarked. "Are you feeling okay? Did something happen at work? Maybe there's something you want to tell me." She was like that. I could never hide anything from Ellie. She seemed to know me better than I knew myself. "I'm just a little upset about the upcoming fundraiser you'll be working on," I replied. "You're so busy. I don't see you for weeks. It would be nice to have someone else do it this time. You've already done so much more for the charity than you need to." "As I always thought, you were proud of my work for the hospital," Ellie replied. "Do you want me to resign, Ted?" "If you say the word, I'll resign tomorrow." "It's not that I want you to quit," I mumbled. "It's just that you do so much, and the girls and I don't see you for a month or more. Can't you let someone else take charge of this event?" "Is it this particular event that bothers you, Ted?" Ellie asked. "Or does it have something to do with Dan Wilkins working with me on this event?" "I'm just trying to tell you that I like having you home with me," I continued. "I know he's an important lawyer and has had a lot of success. He was a star jock and a big Romeo, and probably still is. I continued, he's single and, from what I hear, a ladies' man. I'd like it better if you weren't around him." I said what I had promised myself not to say. I confessed that I was worried about the damn guy. "Ted, you're afraid I'm going to go out with Dan, aren't you?" Ellie gasped. "That was a long time ago, Ted. I'm your wife now. We have 2 daughters. I'm not going to change horses at the crossroads." Somehow, that didn't allay my fears. Ellie seemed to mean that she was stuck with me and would make the best of what she had. I felt like I was the freaking joker in the deck, and she pulled me out. The next step would be the rebound pile. I felt anger and fear. My face turned red, and my hands clenched into fists. I turned around and walked out of the room before I said something even more stupid or started sobbing like a baby. I was just starting to realize how much this situation was bothering me. I decided to get in my pickup truck and go for a drive. It always helped me relax and think things through. As I climbed into the pickup, I heard Ellie calling my name, but I pretended not to hear it. I drove down the road. I had to be back in half an hour. I knew that if I didn't show up for dinner, the girls would be worried. I didn't need my uncertainty affecting them as well. Dinner was a little tense, but the girls were talking so much that they didn't seem to notice that Ellie and I were quiet. We cleaned up and watched TV for an hour, then the girls went to their rooms to do their homework. "Ted, tell me, what do you want me to do about this fundraiser?" Ellie asked quietly, moving closer to me. "I don't have a problem with Dan, but if it bothers you, I'll say no or ask him to resign or think of something else, honey. I hate to be such a jerk, but he bothers me. He bothers me a lot. I know you dated him for a couple of years and you were close. I know you're a wonderful wife and mother," I added. "The problem is that he's better looking, better financially, better with the ladies in general. He trumps me in every way. You're so beautiful, Ellie. You can get any man you want. You'll want something better than a guy like me, and who can blame you?" She just stared at me like I had a frog growing on my nose. I was embarrassed to tell her about my fears and worried how she'd react. "Ted Rigby," she said admonishingly, "how can you even say that? I can't believe you could think such a thing." I didn't know what to say, so I just stayed silent. My thoughts were jumbled, and I didn't know what to think. "You must be the dumbest, blindest man on the planet," she continued. There isn't a woman who knows you who wouldn't switch places with me in a heartbeat. You are handsome, strong, kind, hardworking, and a devoted husband and father. The girls adore you, and frankly, so do I. I bet our fortune exceeds Dan's by a factor of 2, and that's mostly because you're such a good carpenter, and I'm your business manager. You're too soft to be really good at business, but that's fine, Ted. You're kind and sensitive to people and their problems. It never occurred to me that you thought I might leave you for another man. Ellie admitted, honestly, I'm the one who should be worried. I got a gold mine when I had you. I pulled Ellie to me and hugged her until my eyes were dry. She said everything I needed to hear. I felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. I'm sorry for being such a jerk, I finally managed to say. Do what you have to do for the fundraiser. I won't mind. We went to bed early and stayed up late that night. I felt like a teenager again and couldn't get enough of Ellie. I did everything a man can do to pleasure a woman and a few things that a civilized man doesn't even think about. She fell asleep in my arms, and I felt wonderful. Have you ever noticed that the words you share at night and believe in with all your heart and soul start to sound hollow in the light of day? I opened the door and could have gotten Ellie to remove herself from the damn fundraiser, but she got romantic and scattered compliments until I nodded my head. The nagging doubts returned the next day. You can't live with a feeling for 16 years and then give it up in 5 minutes. Over the next few weeks, Ellie was gone for meetings quite often. The girls and I had been through this before, but never had it been this painful for me. The thought of her being with that sneaky Wilkins annoyed me to no end. I tried very hard to act normal, but I knew Ellie was picking up on my insecurities. Our conversations became a bit strained again. She was working hard and not getting enough rest. I hadn't gotten enough sleep in weeks. We were strained to the breaking point. I wasn't sure if it wasn't my imagination, but it seemed like she was spending more time on this fundraiser than any of the previous ones. Several times, I caught her quietly talking on the phone. For someone who was already paranoid, these were all bad signals. Our sex life was gone. I just tried to hold out until casino night was left in the rearview mirror. The afternoon before the big fundraiser, I promised to pick Ellie up from the community center where she and her committee were decorating the space and making final preparations. I was supposed to pick up the girls after practice first and then pick up Ellie. She went with Helen that morning. They had to do some last-minute shopping for prizes. The girls called me to tell me that practice had been cancelled. It had been raining heavily since the previous evening, and a flood warning had been issued because of the rain and snow melt. Since practice was cancelled, I arrived at the community center to pick up Ellie an hour earlier than scheduled. I told the girls to wait in the car while I went inside to see if their mom was ready to leave already or if I needed to come back later to pick her up. I walked into the lobby and ran into Helen. "Can you tell me where Ellie is?" I asked. "I'm a little early today, and I want to tell her I can come back later if I need to. I haven't seen her lately, but she's probably in the office getting games and tickets ready, Ted," Helen replied. "Do you want me to look for her?" I told Helen that I would find her myself and let her keep on with the jewelry. I walked over to the office and cautiously checked the door. It was locked. That was enough to take my suspicion to a new level. Why would they lock themselves from someone? I quickly examined the door. It was one of those cheap hinged doors I refused to use in the houses I built. I knew they couldn't withstand hard knocks. I backed up a few steps and hit the door with my shoulder. The jam gave easily, and the door swung open. I saw Dan Wilkins for the first time since he'd returned to Westbury. He had his arms around Ellie across the table and was holding her tightly. "Ted!" Ellie gasped. I didn't wait for him to continue. I turned and walked back down the hall. I could barely see where I was going. My hands were shaking, and my stomach hurt. All I could think about was getting as far away as quickly as possible. I felt that distance would somehow lessen the pain. Helen started to say something as I walked past her, but the look on my face silenced her. She turned and looked toward the office as I passed her. When the girls asked if Mom was coming with us, I barely managed to carp a negative answer, started the car, and drove out into the rain. The weather suited my mood just fine. As we pulled up to our street, I noticed the creek bubbling and overflowing over a small bridge. Being a cautious person, even in a state of depression the likes of which I had never known, I stopped the car to check out the situation. To my surprise and horror, I realized that the bridge was indeed gone. I almost drove into the raging torrent along with my two girls. My knees shook as I realized how close I had come to terrible danger and possibly death. I snuck back through the rain to the car and turned it around. I was torn between wanting to block the road so no one would drive into the creek and the need to get the girls home half a mile away. I saw a police car at a flooded intersection and decided to let them know the situation. I would then detour around to take another road that didn't require crossing the creek. The policeman, on the other hand, could arrange for a barrier to be set up. As I drove, I realized that I was extremely hurt and disappointed but not surprised by Ellie's cheating. By waiting for him for so many years, I may have created the very problem I feared. That's what always happened in the old Outer Limits and Twilight Zone series. Now I was the guy who wondered if this was all a dream or perhaps a nightmare. As I pulled over on a side street to explain the situation to a police officer, I saw a red BMW whiz by and turn onto my street. I knew I should have blocked the road. I gave the policeman a brief version of the situation and jumped back into the car. "That was Mr. Wilkins's car," said my oldest daughter, Jen. "I hope he doesn't try to cross that bridge." A smile appeared on my face for a moment. Let him mess up his damn fancy car and get a good soaking, I thought. Then I realized that Ellie would be with him. As much as her cheating hurt me, I didn't want her in danger. I pressed down on the gas pedal, trying to catch up to Wilkins. I was almost half a mile behind them when I saw the car fall into the creek where the bridge had been shortly before. Jen shrieked when we saw the front of the car disappear under the water and the back of the car bobbing up and down. As we ran up to the scene, I saw that Wilkins had climbed onto the roof of the car. The water was bubbling around him and rising higher with every second. Water was pouring into the car as Eleanor began to scramble out the same window Wilkins had just used. The girls and I were out of reach and only watched helplessly as Wilkins looked at Eleanor climbing out the window, then turned and jumped onto the ledge left by the eroded bridge. He caught the edge and climbed out of the water. Ellie was now on top of the car, but it had already started floating downstream. The girls and I watched in horror as she tumbled into the torrent of water and disappeared. I threw off my coat and jumped in after her. It was unbelievably cold when I surfaced. I felt numb. Ellie could only swim downstream, so I swam after her as hard as I could. It felt like an eternity had passed, but it was probably only a minute or so when I spotted her floating downstream. It took all my strength, but I managed to catch up with her. She was in a very bad way. I wasn't sure if she was conscious until I felt her grab my hand. We were carried downstream like a couple of branches. Then I saw men standing on a nearby bridge. They were waving at me, and one lay on the edge of the bridge under the railing. He reached down and held his hands as close to the water as he could. Every few seconds, I managed to touch the ground and nudged Ellie in the guy's direction. It wasn't easy, but I steered our way toward the Samaritan on the bridge. The thing was, he himself would never be able to reach us. I calculated our speed and lifted Ellie into my arms as we swam up to the bridge. I was weakening quickly as the incredibly cold water was robbing me of my strength. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to lift Ellie high enough for the guy to catch her. As we swam underneath him, I felt Ellie suddenly break free from my aching arms. The guy had grabbed her. I then went under the water. I struggled to get to the surface, but it was getting harder and harder to keep my head above water. My strength was quickly leaving me. I felt a tree branch hit me in the face, and I grabbed onto it. I clung to it for a few seconds, and then I felt something smash into my left arm and side and carry me away. It was some kind of log or tree. I couldn't tell. Then it caught on something with the far end and started to turn. As it turned, it pushed me out into shallow water. The water was waist deep, but the log was still dragging me. I went as low as I could and felt something wooden and hard underneath. It must have been the remains of a footbridge or something. I grabbed onto it and tried to hold on. The floating object slid down my back, scratching it as it passed. I realized I could only hold on with my right hand. The left was unresponsive. I tried to pull myself out of the water, but my legs were just leaden. I was about to give up when I heard Jen. She was beside me and had gotten as far into the water as she could. I felt her grab me by the collar of my shirt and start pulling. Even in my weakened mental state, I worried that if I snapped downstream, Jen wouldn't let me go, and I would drag her down with me. This fear made me crawl and wriggle with all the strength and determination I was capable of. Together, we still managed to get out of the water. I could hear Jen talking to someone on her cell phone as I tried to sit up. Then I saw that my left arm was bent at a bizarre angle. I wondered how on earth I would be able to work with an arm like that. That was the last conscious thought I remember. Then I heard voices from far away. It was like this several times before I was actually able to open my eyes and look around. It was obvious that I was in the hospital, and my arm was bandaged. I saw Jen, Audrey, and Ellie sitting around my bed. Jen noticed that I had opened my eyes and exclaimed loudly, "Daddy, how are you feeling?" "That was the bravest and coolest thing I've ever seen," she exclaimed. "You saved Mom's life. That coward Wilkins abandoned her and ran ashore to save himself. You jumped right into the stream and then lifted Mom up to the guy on the bridge." As Jen spoke, memories came flooding back to me. I looked at my left hand. I still couldn't feel it, but at least I could see my hand. I wiggled my fingers and felt relief wash over me. "Your arm was broken pretty badly, but it will heal fine, Dad," Jen said. "It looked awful when I helped you out of the water. I bet you're glad I was doing cross-country running." Jen asked, "I chased you for over a mile trying to catch you. I wasn't going to give up even if I had to run all the way to the river." My throat hurt, and I couldn't speak. I found out later that I had been under the knife for 2 hours, and it was the effects of the medication they had given me. Ellie just listened as Jen recounted the events. She didn't say a word. After a very short time, I fell asleep again. It was 4 days before I was discharged. I had a lot of time to think while I was in the hospital. The girls made a big fuss around me when I finally got home. My parents and Ellie's parents were there to greet me. It was all very touching. "Son, you saved our daughter's life at the risk of your own," Ellie's father announced in front of everyone. "Honestly, I expected no less from my daughter's husband, but it sure is nice to know that you're exactly the kind of man I hoped you would be. If it had been up to that damn Wilkins, we'd only have memories of her right now." I blushed at my father-in-law's rare praise. His sincerity could not be doubted. We had a dinner to celebrate my homecoming. Finally, everyone dispersed. The girls hugged me and went to bed. I made my way to the bedroom and crawled in between the sheets. Ellie watched my every move but didn't say anything. I was exhausted and fell asleep immediately. During the night, I woke up to Ellie's sobs a little while later. I fell asleep again. I sat at my desk. The girls had already left for school. I made mental notes about what I needed to do right away. First, I had to meet with my crew to find out how far behind schedule we were. I'd probably have to hire someone else to take my place for a couple of months or so. Ellie's voice broke my concentration. "Ted, I'm so sorry about everything. You saved my life even after everything I did to you. When I was tossed around in the flood of water, I really wanted to die, but I knew you'd come for me. It wasn't hope, it was certainty. Dan was just a stupid mistake. He's not even good enough to serve your shoes. I made a serious mistake, but I'm determined to make it up to you, Ted. Even if it takes the rest of my life, I'll do anything you ask, Ted. Ellie promised, just tell me what you want. Ellie, I replied, pulling out my briefcase, I've had a lot of time to think. You just happened to get into the flow. I couldn't stand by and watch you get hurt or die because of an accident. But if you had stood next to me and said you wanted to jump into the raging waters, I would have done everything I could to prevent you from doing so. If after all my efforts you did jump, I would feel bad watching you being carried away. I admitted, however, I wouldn't jump in after you. Ellie held her breath as she listened to me. I continued, ultimately, each of us is responsible for our actions. You knowingly, willingly, even eagerly jumped into Dan Wilkins's arms and into his bed. It wasn't an accident. I tried to convince you not to get involved with him, but you did it anyway. Ted, I was wrong. I know that now. He means nothing to me. Please believe me when I tell you I only love you, Ellie begged. I haven't seen him once since that day. I'll do anything to make it up to you. That's good to hear, Ellie, I replied, pulling out my briefcase. But I realize that you're not the one who's too good for me. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Just sign these divorce papers for me, and I won't ask you for anything else.